Everybody. So we're going to do a topic analysis for the March topic. I have a PowerPoint that I'll post on the PF drive. Yeah, I'm just going to be sharing my screen, and then any questions that you may have at the, you're going to be watching a YouTube video of this. So just pause it, Slack message me. I'll be in a round. But I am happy to answer questions, once I'm out of the round, and we obviously will be keeping the conversation going. Is this recording? What's happening? Wait, let me stop. Okay, yes, it is recording. Jesus Christ. Guys, it is off to a good start. Okay. So, March topic is the benefits of creating the United States Space Force outweigh the harms. I know many of us are bummed. I'm bummed too. But having done a lot of research into the topic tonight, I'm more optimistic than I was when I started. I still think ASAT would have been the better topic, but I think this is more balanced than initially meets the eye. It's not that interesting, but it's at least more balanced than I thought. Okay. All right, so here's the roadmap. First, going to talk about some key definitions, just looking at the resolution. What is the Space Force? Something I think is challenging to wrap your head around is where in the org chart does the Space Force fall? So we'll go into that as well. We'll also talk about the history of the Space Force, because it's not something that just organically was created, Donald Trump just envisioned it and turned it into being. It's not like that. It's kind of actually been around for a while. Talk just very briefly about other partnerships the Space Force has with agencies. You're probably wondering, how does this interact with NASA? And we'll get into that. Most importantly, what the Space Force does and what they view their role as being in the military. And finally, potential arguments, what you're really here for. Yes. Okay. All right. So starting with, what does the resolution mean? What we see here, it's, the benefits of creating the United States Space Force outweigh the harms. So there's a couple of things here. Most importantly, the United States Space Force is a service branch, and we're going to go into what that means, but a service branch of the United States Armed Forces. Unsurprisingly, it focuses on space. This is different from some of the resolutions. Varsity probably know, well, you're all varsity now. Older debaters probably know this, so sorry that this is redundant, but new debaters might be unfamiliar with the language of the resolution being about do the benefits outweigh the harms? And so this is basically a weighing mechanism. Contrast this with the no first use policy topic or the NSA topic, because those were proposing a deviation from the status quo. This topic is not about deviating from the status quo. The Space Force has already been created. We're just now debating, take a snapshot of the universe as it exists today. Has it been a good call? However, you still want to provide a framework, even though we're talking about harms versus benefits. You have to think about, strategically, what does that mean? An obvious way is you can do a cost benefit analysis from a purely economic standpoint. That's probably not going to be super appropriate in this topic, because we're dealing with things like national security, national power, which aren't easily quantified. Other comparisons could be international standing, political costs. You also want to think about opportunity costs. If we hadn't created the Space Force, what would we be doing instead? And did creating the Space Force actually close off those avenues? And then just creating, isn't going to really blow your mind, but just so you have context moving forward. In December 2019, AFSPC, which we're going to talk about, don't freak out, was redesignated as the US Space Force. Notice redesignated. So again, this isn't just Donald Trump is sitting in the White House and just births this idea into being. Sort of just a slight reorganization. Okay, we got a nest. Where does the Space Force fit into the military org chart? As I stated in the definitions, the US Space Force is a service branch. Okay, what does that mean? They are the groups of personnel and equipment in the United States military. And you're probably familiar with the others. There are now 6 of them. There used to be 5, but the Space Force makes the 6th. We've got the Army, the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, and now the Space Force. Okay. As you probably know, the president is the commander-in-chief of all of the armed forces. What you may be a little more shaky on is how does it trickle down from the president? And the president forms military policy through coordinating with basically 2 agencies. Departments. The Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security. Okay, here's kind of an org chart. Let me break this down for you. So you notice right at the top, this is only the Department of Defense. Let's set aside the Department of Homeland Security. That's where the Coast Guard comes in. So just like set them aside. The bulk of this is in the DoD. You notice then that there are 3 sub-departments. There's the Department of the Army, Department of the Navy, Department of the Air Force. Those sound but are not synonymous with the military service branches. So what this means is that the Department of the Army is in charge of the US Army. Okay. The Department of the Navy, however, is responsible for both the US Navy and the US Marine Corps. The Department of the Air Force is responsible for the US Air Force, but also the US Space Force. So keep in mind that the Department of the Air Force is like a different thing than the US Air Force. And I know this is like very semantic, but I just want to make sure you're using things precisely and have context for when you're doing your own research. Here's where it gets really hairy. There are 8 uniformed services. We've already learned about 6 of them, right? The service branches. Department of the Army, just the Army. Department of the Navy, this is the slide we just did, right? Now, just kind of looking at this, Department of the Army, Department of the Navy, Department of the Air Force, those are 5 of the 6. And then the Department of Homeland Security gets us, the 6th, US Coast Guard, the 6th of the service branches. But there are actually 2 more uniformed services. There is the U.S. Public Health Service Commissioned Corps. That's the Surgeon General leads that. And then there's also the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has a commissioned officers corps. You don't need to really know that. But I just want, again, to draw the distinction here. Uniformed services is a different thing than the service branches, which are 6 of them, and the Space Force is 1 of them. Okay, so as I've said, Space Force is a service force. So it's in charge of things like maintenance functions. The Navy, the Marine Corps, the Army, they are all in a similar way service forces. And they're really focused on the human capital, the actual physical materiel. I've just given context here. The Navy's motto is man, train, and equip. So they're all focused on just the people, right? They're basically responsible, though, for providing the combatant commands with the physical forces that they employ. So you're probably thinking, what are combatant commands? Here's the critical distinction. The services, so the US Army, US Space Force, the US Navy, they actually don't have anything to do formally with when, how, and where forces are employed or used. They're just responsible for making sure the forces exist in the first place, for generating capable forces. Combatant commands are in charge of those things when, how, and where forces are employed. So this brings us to United States Space Command, separate thing from the Space Force. So the United States Space Force, of course, supports the United States Space Command, but the United States Space Command is a unified combatant command under the Department of Defense. I think the most intuitive way to think about the commands is understanding that most of them are geographical. There's 10, I think. And so there's United States Africa Command, right? And think about it this way, it's not just the army in Africa. The Navy deals with things in Africa. The Marine Corps deals with things in Africa. So the commands, the combatant commands coordinate all of the manpower of each of the service branches and just decide how, when, and why they're used. The geographical ones are easy to understand. Some, however, are functional. We talked a lot in the NSA topic about US Cyber Command. That's a combatant command force. I'm sorry, it's a combatant command. US Space Command falls under the geographic category. And so the reason United States Space Command exists is because the Air Force probably has something to do with space. Obviously, the Space Force does. Maybe sometimes like the Marines need to get involved. Who knows? The commands exist to coordinate the manpower of these disparate services. And so each combatant command is responsible for their particular region or area and all of the forces in it, regardless of what service they come from, regardless of whether or not they're from the Army, they're from the Navy, they're from the Space Force. So just want the real major thing here to take away is that the United States Space Force is like the group of people. Space Command is across all of the service branches dealing with things in space, mobilizing people, mobilizing materiel in pursuit of American national interests in space. Okay, just want to take a step back here. So I've been talking a lot about the status quo. What's the history? We were talking about a change, right? We talked about creating the US Space Force. I really just want to hit this home clearly. Quick refresher, United States Space Force versus Space Command. Space Command is a unified combatant command. It's responsible for coordinating all military operations in outer space. That does not just mean the Space Force. It could be the Air Force. It could be other forces. Again, so it's distinct from, wow, I'm really trying to hit this one for you guys. Think about the TLDR on this is that the Space Force are the people. They're responsible for organizing, training, and equipping space forces, as well as like equipment. Space Command is the entity that decides how do we use those people. The fact, however, that they are distinct entities means that Space Command has actually been around longer than the United States Space Force. And this makes sense. It's not like we just woke up in 2020 and it's like, hey, we should probably be thinking about space. The Air Force and the Army and all sorts of other parts of the military have been thinking about space. So the real question here is whether or not we split off from the Air Force and create just a group of people who only focus on space. That's the central question. I mean, we have done it. So the central question is like whether or not that was a good thing. Okay. So like I said, Space Command has been around longer than the US Space Force, which came around in 2019. Here's just kind of a timeline. It was originally created in 85. Picture late Cold War era. Satellites are becoming more important. Anti-missile systems are becoming more important. And so there was a real need to have joint command and control for all military forces in outer space. 2002 rolls along post 9/11. It's actually deactivated then, and its responsibilities and forces are merged into US Strategic Command. Keep this in mind because we're going to talk about it later. 2019, right before Space Force is founded, New Space Command is established. This time it's explicitly focused on space as a war-fighting domain. So we really want to keep in mind that Space Command was deactivated in 2002. So there was real question about whether or not we even want to normatively think about space as a separate region that we fight wars in. There might not be, and we're going to talk about that later. Okay, that was the timeline of US Space Command. Here's the timeline of the US Space Force. 1982. Sarah, why does it start in 1982? Because you'll notice I said this acronym earlier, AFSPC, the Air Force Space Command. Been around since the 80s. So I'm going to go through kind of the development, and you're going to see at the end that like the Air Force Space Command just basically turns into Space Force. So that's why I'm starting in 82. Okay. So 1982, space operations is the primary mission. Cold War era space operations are pretty much focused on like missile warning, launch operations, satellite control, and space surveillance. That's the focus. That's like the zeitgeist in which the Air Force decides, hey, we need to split off and just think about space as something separate. 1991, the Air Force Space Command plays a pretty major role in Operation Desert Storm. You may or may not be familiar with it, with the left hook maneuver. But basically, AFSPC really validates the command's continuing focus on support to the other services through the use of GPS, which allowed this like left hook maneuver, and just generally proved the value of space-based capabilities in joint military operations. Same deal, same sort of validation happens in with U.S. Central Command, helping out U.S. Central Command after 9/11 with maneuvers in Afghanistan and Iraq. Here's a little bit of back and forth. 2005, Air Force cyberspace operations are transferred into AFSPC. But then in 2018, they're actually transferred back out. And the idea was we just want the Air Force Space Command to really just focus on space superiority. And then in 2019, the AFSPC is just redesignated as the US Space Force. So it's been around for a while, and in some ways this is a paper creation. We'll talk more about that later, but know that the history does not quite start in 2019. Okay. So what other? This is just one quick slide about the other partnerships that the Space Force has. I will not belabor the United States Space Command point, but you're probably wondering, okay, so the Space Force splits off from Air Force. What's that relationship like? They're now keep in mind, they're co-equal sister service branches under the United States Department of the Air Force. Space Force splits off, and it's a very small service right now. So it derivates most of its support personnel from the Air Force. So like civil engineers, logistics, contractors, finance, medical, they're bumming off those people off of the Air Force right now. They also importantly share the same service secretary and military department, and they also have the same feeders. So the United States Air Force Academy is now feeding to both of the services. The National Reconnaissance Office, moving on, is a DoD agency, and they're part of the intelligence community. I only bring them up because there have been some proposals to join them under the Space Force. So you may see that come up. Just know that they're basically in charge of designing, building, launching, and maintaining intelligence satellites. So you can see why it might make sense that they go under the Space Force. And finally, NASA. So NASA, think about it this way. NASA is an independent agency of the US government. They are responsible for civil spaceflight. Contrast that obviously with the Space Force, which is military spaceflight. However, even prior to the US Space Force being developed, NASA and the AFSPC had a longstanding cooperative relationship. Space Force supports NASA launches out of the Kennedy Space Center. There's range support and rescue operations. So they do have they have a symbiotic relationship. Obviously, any sort of like R&D that benefits NASA is probably going to benefit the Space Force. Okay, so going to spend a decent amount of time here. So let me get a drink of water. What exactly does the US Space Force do? Started in 2019. And here is their mission statement. Really focusing on freedom of operation in space, prompt and sustained space operations, and overall just to protect the United States interests and deter aggression in space. I'll talk a little bit later about why the stakes are so high in space. I know Kabir is really into Kessler syndrome, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. And so, it's just really focusing on protecting the U.S. hegemony in space. So you should all read this entire document. In August 2020, Space Force has put out a document entitled Space Power, Doctrine for Space Forces. Doctrine is a word that's going to come up a lot. It's the expression of how military forces contribute to campaigns, major operations. It's basically a guide to how the services operate. They're not hard and fast rules, as you're going to see later. They're pretty general heuristics for how certain services operate. And often doctrine is really related to the medium in which war is being fought. So, how you fight a battle on the sea is different from how you fight a battle on land. And then the same analogy goes that space has totally different literal physical laws about that would impact how we would fight war there. So doctrine is something that is important, and it's actually one of the reasons that maybe splitting off the Space Force is a good idea. But here's what they have to say about their own doctrine. We start at the very high level. They identify 3 cornerstone responsibilities, and then we're going to talk about, this is just getting more and more granular, 5 core competencies, which are, things we think we have to be good at if we want to fulfill these responsibilities. And then underneath that are 7 space power disciplines. You have to master the disciplines to have the core competencies, and you need to be good in those core competencies to achieve these 3 responsibilities. So think about it as like a pyramid. Anyways, the 3 cornerstone responsibilities are first, preserving freedom of it. Again, all of this is in the space power document, which you all should read cover to cover. So the first is preserving freedom of action. What this means is at a high, again, these are very high level, but the United States Space Force is trying to promote the United States' unfettered access to and freedom to operate in space as just being a vital national interest. There are sort of 4 components of national power. There's diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. And the argument goes that all 4 of these are critical, that you have space, that you have the ability to move freely in space. So the idea is military space forces fundamentally exist to protect, defend, and preserve this freedom of action for the United States. Second cornerstone responsibility is to enable joint lethality and effectiveness. Okay, what does that mean? Space capabilities strengthen operation in other domains of warfare. There's these things called joint functions, which is how different forces work together. But overall, the Army doesn't work if the US can't project or employ power in space. How do we know to move around? How do we use GPS? Now, by the same token, military space forces also rely on military operations in other domains to protect and defend space freedom. So there's this mutually beneficial relationship between the Space Force and other services. And one of the second cornerstone responsibility is that military space forces operate as in closely integrated joint forces across the entire conflict continuum to support a broad range of military operations. Okay, last one. And again, these are high level like goals of the organization, is to provide independent options. So a central tenet of military power is the ability to independently achieve strategic effects. That is, without reference to other types of power. So in this capacity, military space power is more than an adjunct to land power or sea power or air power or cyber power or what have you. So contrast this with the second core responsibility. So across the conflict continuum, military space power provides national leadership with independent military options. So options that don't rely on the Air Force existing, that don't rely on the Army existing. So overall, the goal is to achieve national objectives by projecting power in space. Okay. So those are the goals, right? How do we do it? And again, this is all from Space Power, published in August 2020, which you all should read cover to cover. 5 core competencies. So again, the core competencies are how military space power is employed. So in order to achieve these 3 responsibilities, we need to have these 5 core competencies. The first is space security. Space security is basically establishing and promoting stable conditions for civil, commercial, the intelligence community, multinational partners, all of those people, stable conditions so that they have safe and secure access to space. So just like at a very basic minimum, making sure space is safe and stable and secure. Combat power projection is the idea that we need to integrate defensive and offensive operations to maintain a desired level of freedom of action. Remember, that was the responsibility relative to a potential adversary. So what this means is it's kind of working in concert with other competencies to enhance freedom of action, meaning open up the ability of the United States to do what is best for us. We can do this maybe by deterring aggression or compelling an adversary to change behavior, basically strengthening us in combat. Whether that be on the ground or in space. Space mobility and logistics is enabling movement and support of military equipment and personnel in the space domain. So like from the ISS to a satellite, and then also from the space domain back to Earth, and then from Earth to the space domain, facilitating transfer. Think about this as logistics, right? The fourth one is information mobility. This is providing timely, rapid, reliable collection and transportation of data in support of tactical and operational decision-making and strategic decision-making. So this is probably a core competency that like all military services need to have, but it's something the Space Force has identified they need to. And then finally is space domain awareness. This is the effective identification, characterization, and understanding of particular factors about the space domain that affect space operations and thereby affect the security of our nation. So think about this as being like knowledge and human capital. We need to know a lot about the space domain, about orbital mechanics, about Kessler syndrome, to make sure that we are informing the nation, that we're informing other services, that we're informing Space Command and other commands about just things that are happening in space. Okay, those are the 5 core competencies. Drilling down even more specifically, the competencies help us achieve those responsibilities. These disciplines are particular ways that particular things the Space Force needs to know in order to achieve the 5 core competencies. We've got orbital warfare, knowledge of orbital maneuvering, offensive and defensive fires. We've got space electromagnetic warfare, which is just knowledge of the electromagnetic spectrum, maneuvering within it, non-kinetic firing within the spectrum. Space battle management. So knowing think about like that last one about space domain awareness of the 5 core competencies. We need to know how to orient ourselves within the space domain and make decisions to achieve our objectives. Identifying hostile actions and entities, targeting direct action in response to just like what the threat environment might be. Space access and sustainment is knowledge of the processes, support, logistics that are required to maintain and prolong operations in the space domain. Military intelligence it's a discipline that all branches of the military are going to have, but it's the knowledge to conduct intelligence, threat-focused operations that are based on the insights that we glean from any intelligence. Cyber operations is the knowledge to defend the global networks upon which the military space power relies. And then finally, engineering and acquisitions. Military space power needs the best capabilities in the world to protect the space domain. So we have to form relationships with science and technology and acquisition partnerships, especially with other national security organizations, commercial entities as well. So just making sure that that the U.S. Space Force is properly equipped. Okay. So that's kind of what the United States Space Force is doing right now. We're going to look at the budget to kind of like delve into that a little bit more. 2020 budget was $40 million, kind of a drop on the bucket. 2021 budget is $15 billion. However, this is just like cut from the United States Air Force budget, so it's not like a $15 billion increase to the government. Here are just some line items in those budgets. There's launch vehicles, upgrading launch systems, lots of work on GPS and satellite construction, missile warning systems. And then there's the space-based overhead persistent infrared system, which is a Space Force system that is working on infrared space surveillance. It works a lot with missile warning, missile defense, battle space characterization, and it's a system based on satellites that are in geosynchronous Earth orbit or satellites that are in highly elliptical orbits, and just ground-based surveillance. So like, it's not like the Space Force is like, the moral of the story is it's not like the Space Force is going up and fighting space battles. Like, this isn't The Expanse. This isn't Starship Troopers. Now, does it help us down the road if we like get there? Probably. But I think the Khan has a pretty good argument that like we don't really have a need for that right now. Okay. So you've heard me talk for a while, and I'm sorry about that. So want to talk about the potential arguments, and I'm actually going to show just a 5-minute podcast that I thought was good. It's just like, it's 5 minutes that provides just a general background on the pros and cons of Space Force. So let me hit escape here. This is from the Brookings Institution. So it's credible.
My name is Frank Rose. I'm a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy program here at Brookings. And I want to talk to you today about President Trump's decision last Thursday to create a space force. This has been an issue it's really driven by two primary things. First, Russia, China, and other potential adversaries have been developing anti satellite weapons that can damage or destroy US and allied space systems. Russia and China are developing these capabilities because they believe, not incorrectly, that the United States is dependent on space enabled data to conduct military operations. Therefore, they are seeking to develop these capabilities in order to deny the United States and its allies access to that space derived information. Secondly, there is concern amongst experts as well as members of Congress that the Air Force, where the vast majority of U.S. national security space assets are situated, is not focusing enough time or attention on the space mission. And this concern is driven by the belief that the U.S. Air Force is dominated by fighter pilots. As a result, space officers are not given similar career advancement opportunities. Therefore, in order to ensure that we have the best and the brightest working on space issues, the view among some experts is we need to create a separate space corps that can nurture the development of these professionals. Now, as some of you may know, last year, the House Armed Services Committee, through the National Defense Authorization Act, proposed creating a semi autonomous space corps under the Air Force, which would be similar to how the U.S. Marine Corps sits under the Department of the Navy. Interestingly, the Trump administration, specifically Secretary of Defense Mattis, Secretary of the Air Force Heather Wilson, and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force David Goldfein, all came out strongly opposed to this proposal, as they wanted to keep the mission squarely within the construct of the United States Air Force, but they understood that they needed to do things somewhat differently and put more emphasis on outer space missions. Now, at the end of the day, when Congress finally agreed on a compromised National Defense Authorization Conference report, the Congress did two things. One, they enhanced the authorities of the commander of the Air Force Space Command to give him more authority to acquire and operate U.S. space assets. And secondly, they directed an independent study to examine whether the Space Corps made sense. Therefore, I think many people, including the Department of Defense, were quite surprised by President Trump's announcement last week that he was, quote, creating an independent space force. This is not consistent with where his administration has been on the issue over the past year and a half. Secondly, and I think most experts agree, the president himself does not have the authority to create a separate space force. Most experts would argue that only the Congress, under its authorities in the Constitution, can create a separate military force. Opinions in the Congress about whether it makes sense to create a special space force or a separate space force vary.
I'm going to stop it there because it's showing that it's a little dated. We're past that. Congress did it. Sharing my screen again. I think the best part of that video is just the focus on, what's the underlying rationale, and centering on potential concerns about our adversaries. Okay. All right. Gonna go through why. Testing. Hope this works. Okay, well, if it doesn't, I will re-record. Here are some major pro arguments. One is just catching up with our adversaries. There's been an increasing militarization of space. It's not even, Khan might try to portray this as outpacing our adversaries, but it's really just catching up. Russia has had an independent space force since the 90s. China split off their strategic support force from the other branches of the armed forces in 2015. So, they put space, cyber, and information warfare systems under a single roof. There's another argument that it's going to be really hard to argue costs on the con. You can check the numbers about this, but the Department of the Air Force, it really hasn't changed between the 2019 and 2020 budgets when they stood up the Air Force or the Space Force. Most of the assets and personnel existed before they established Space Force. So in large part, like I said earlier, it's just a paper creation. There's a couple different projections about the cost of establishing the Space Force. DoD says $500 million for the first 5 years. Congressional Budget Office says one-time costs at $1 billion between $3 billion. Air Force Secretary says $13 billion 5 year. So in any event, in the scope of our military budget, it's not huge. Huge pro argument, I think, is just coherence and efficiency. Even if you don't add additional resources at this very moment, down the line, Space Force can scale with additional resources as needed. We'd be centralizing space assets under one roof. The focus was, of course, on splitting off from the Air Force, but there were actually a number of assets and responsibilities transferred from other services as well. Don't have the statistic off the top of my head, but one number I saw is that they were in 60 different commands across the military. So there's, big efficiency idea there. Definitely can talk about just the stakes are very, very high. So in 2007, China destroyed one of its satellites in low Earth orbit, which demonstrated its ability to threaten core US communications infrastructure. Unfortunately, the satellite's destruction produced a pretty extensive debris field, a lot of which remains in orbit today. So this specific field still poses a long-term threat to the military and civilian use of low Earth orbit. So the demonstration made pretty clear that a war in space could result in the long-term loss of very valuable real estate in low Earth orbit, which would hinder both military operations and civilian space infrastructure. Last thing I'll mention here is that there's been some talk, and there's a really great article in the Cato Institute that from the Cato Institute that I cite at the end that everyone should read that one cover to cover as well. Um, Argument goes that there's a US Naval Academy, right? There's a US Air Force Academy. There's not a US Space Academy. And some say that this is stymieing development of space doctrine and thinking about how would we actually fight war in space. And so breaking off the Space Force and having them just entirely focus on that could help this critical gap. Also, obviously, read this CSIS article and read the CSIS companion article about why a Space Force can wait. I think I initially thought Khan had the harder side because like I didn't view the harms as being that salient. But came up with a couple. So there's a couple of these that are defensive arguments, right? This first one that I have here is defensive. The mere fact that like space is a distinct geographic and operating domain doesn't mean we need a separate force for it. Like we don't have a separate submarine force, for example, even though like undersea parts of the ocean are different than the top of the ocean. Okay. That's one thing. That's defensive, right? Because it's more just like, we don't need this. It's not like a reason that the Space Force is actively harmful. Also, kind of defensive. You can maybe turn it into offensive by saying that major reorganizations actually hurt the military. But, to case in point, Department of Homeland Security and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, like they were reorganized and they don't really necessarily guarantee good outcomes. Also, go back to 2002. I talked about this earlier. We already tried separating space out as its own combatant command. And then we thought better of the idea in 2002 and we merged it with strategic command. The experience could be suggestive there. If you think about what has actually happened, additionally, breaking up the Air Force results in two like much smaller organizations. One is about the size of the Marine Corps, pretty small. The other much smaller than that. It's only like 2,000 people are in the Space Force. So if the goal is a much stronger voice for space issues, are we really sure that splitting them into two organizations is really going to help? AF can argue back to this that Space Force now has a seat on the Joint Chiefs, which could make a difference. There's this guy named Carl Bilder who has this book called The Masks of War. And it's all about the US Air Force. And he argues that the US Air Force has historically been a military service that defines itself around technology. Like they're the nerds of the military. Again, defensive, but Ned can argue that no major change or separate department is actually needed to create a culture for space technology, like developing space technologies. Okay, this would be more offensive. You can argue that air and space operations have to be linked super closely. Systems in space are very vulnerable. They're going to remain vulnerable. And, air breathing assets are going to have to back up satellites in future wars. It's not like, we have like this strict border between air and space, right? In other words, air and space operations are going to have to be linked really closely, just like they were before we split it off. So it's not really clear how breaking the Air Force into two will actually achieve that goal. And I think Khan can definitely make an argument that it harms it. This point that the Space Force has unclear goals and no clearly defined organizational culture is the biggest thing that the Cato Institute says damns it. The point is really worth belaboring because culture is so intensely important to the functioning of a military organization. There's a quote from Cato, quote, "The problem is less the specific cultural traits of the Space Force than the apparent absence of any strong organizational culture at all." So we've kind of just split them off, given them resources, and we have no idea how they're going to do. This could be a strong con argument because it again gives an active harm of the Space Force, but um, in general, the services have been very opposed to any arms limitation treaties. So if the Space Force manages to get off the ground, so to speak, and actually acquire the bureaucratic heft it needs to accomplish its core missions, it could be acting as an interest group within the US government to prevent the execution of strong multilateral arms control agreements. And so the impacts here feed into like militarization of space, of course, that space is a common good. And so we don't want Kessler syndrome can be really harmful. Kessler syndrome is the idea that, um, well, if you extrapolate it out to its logical conclusion, that if a satellite crashes into another satellite, the debris just hangs in low Earth orbit. And you can imagine like if this just kept going, it's sort of a what's the word? Uh oh my gosh. I guess that's what I get for doing this at 2 a.m. But it's the type of thing it snowballs, right? And so if this keeps happening and satellites keep crashing into each other, there could be such a strong debris field in low Earth orbit that we could actually like never leave the planet. That's Kessler syndrome. Anyways, you can feed into impacts of like we need to keep space safe, and multilateral arms limitations can help that. So if Space Force is going to be agitating against that, that would be a bad thing. And finally, we gave those arguments earlier. Well, not arguments. I gave the numbers earlier about just the demand on the military budget. Khan could make this argument. I don't think it's huge. I think it's just a drop in the bucket in terms of the the broad scope of our large military budget. No comment. At the end of the PowerPoint, I've got some recommended reading. Really, I think like everyone should read every single one of these articles. They're fantastic. And they give good arguments on both sides. If I had to like, if you were to start somewhere, I mean, start with the background ones, but I think the biggest one to read is the Cato, the very last one I've linked, does a really phenomenal job. So highly recommend reading all of these. Mm-hmm. Okay. That's that. Again, like Slack message me any questions. I may have my friend Sam, the one who used to work at the Pentagon. I might have him come and judge around or like just like a Q&A session. He thinks AF is much stronger, which was my intuition as well. But he's not a debater, so who knows? Yeah, Slack message me any questions. Remember that like you need to be ready to hit the ground running by next Tuesday because we need to get a lot of practice rounds in on this topic. So you need to have both of your cases done. They don't have to be good, but that you have to be ready to run something. Happy to look over cases, happy to answer questions. And this is on the PF website if you ever want to just rewatch it, as well as the PowerPoint is in the Google Drive. All right. Well, I'm going to log off and awkwardly end the presentation. And I think it'll be an okay topic. Like it's not the disaster I thought it was going to be. And on that cheery note, have a great night, everybody.